Hey, how you doing? It's Clayton here from howtodrawcomics.net and welcome to part 1 of my Bulma fan art demonstration. In this video, I'm going to show you how to establish the pose, placement, proportions, and anatomy of your female figures. Let's get into it. Okay, so the application that I use for all of my artwork, whether I'm drawing or inking especially, not necessarily coloring, even though I'm sure this application is very capable of it. But the application that I'm using here is Clip Studio Paint. It used to be called Manga Studio, but I love this application because out of all the other digital drawing apps that are out there, it feels the most natural. It feels like I'm working traditionally. Now, working digitally used to be a big deal for me because up until the point I'd switched, I had always drawn with a good old-fashioned pencil and paper, and it was very strange to pick up a stylus, draw on a tablet, and then look up at a screen. But over time, as with anything else, I got used to it, and slowly but surely, I found myself in a place where it was now more uncomfortable and strange for me to draw with a pencil and paper than it was to just draw digitally. And I used Photoshop for a very long time to do both my drawings and inks and coloring. But once I'd tried out the tools within Clip Studio Paint, I just absolutely fell in love with the program. The inking tools within it were absolutely amazing, just left the most beautifully weighted line on the page. And the pencil brush, which you can see me using here, simply works so well when it came to pressure sensitivity. And the thickness that I like to use for my line, I was able to build up a drawing bit by bit simply by going over the top of the sketch that I was doing and refining the areas that I wanted to bring clarity to. The particular pencil brush that I'm using here is one that was created by Mark Brunet, which you can actually find on CubeBrush for free and download for yourself. It's an incredible brush, and the name of it is called Mark Brunet's legendary line art brush. He uses it for a lot of his penciling, and now I use it for all of mine as well. And it really does allow you to just keep things so loose in the beginning of your drawings. So just very lightly sketch out what it is you want on the page and then go over the top of it and pull it together in the shape and the fashion that you want. And you'll see me go through that process here as bit by bit I construct these female poses, sculpting them out, testing out, and experimenting with different combinations of pose and positioning and scale, camera angle. I never necessarily know exactly what is going to work best in the beginning. Sometimes I might have an idea. Sometimes there'll be something inside my head and I think, man, this could work really, really well. And then I try it out. I jot it down onto the page as a really quick thumbnail sketch, and lo and behold, it's not as great as I thought it was going to be. And so I try out something else, maybe a new idea that is based on the previous one with some slight changes. Or maybe I realize that it's just not going to work whatsoever, and I try something completely different. It's important to go through this series of steps, this phase of the drawing process very early on, because you want to make sure that the time that you invest into the development of that idea going forth is well spent, that you're going to get a good return on that effort, on the energy that you're putting into it. And so I always view this stage of the drawing process as sort of like the dummy test stage. In fact, I view these mannequin models, which is the structure that you're seeing me lay down onto the page here, as a test dummy. It can be thrown out. It's completely expendable. And so I never become too attached to anything I lay down onto the page in the beginning. Because if I do, I'm going to be afraid to venture beyond it, to try out new things, better alternatives that could lead to a more ideal outcome. I wish that I knew exactly what I wanted from the get-go, and that every line I laid down onto the canvas was going to be the final line, but so often it's not. More often than not, it is the wrong line. And I have to see where to go wrong sometimes in order to redirect myself down the correct path. And it's a slow process. Sometimes I feel like it could be much more optimized, but for some reason or another, I've just found myself to be the sort of artist that needs to go through a little bit of a challenge along the way, that needs to come head to head with obstacles in order to move forward, in order to make the best calls. I need to fail in order to succeed. And so failures for me are no big deal. Over time, I realized that they were actually a good thing. I found that they needed to happen, that they were just part of the process, and that the more I failed, the closer I would get to what it was I was really trying to capture on the page. Not to mention, and this is something of important note, you need to give yourself the opportunity to warm up. Now, I was constructing these poses at the beginning of the day, before I'd drawn anything at all, and in fact, I hadn't drawn anything in a few days. And so, I'll admit right now that I was a little bit rusty, a little bit unsure of myself. I didn't have the confidence that I normally had. And even if you draw every single day, the first drawing of the day is always gonna feel like that. You just need to get into your groove. You need to find your zone. And the best way to do that is just to take a load off, to relax a little bit, and embrace the process of just freely drawing anything down onto the canvas. It doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to work. Just have fun with it. Because when you're having fun, creativity is able to take hold. Ideas are able to flow easier. And you'll find that in complete contrast to when you're being too careful, when you're being too precious about what it is you're drawing, that when you're able to keep it looser, the things you come up with are better than you could have ever imagined. It's interesting that sometimes in order to do our best work, we have to let go a little bit. We have to take our hands off the steering wheel and let the process go in autopilot. And so the best place to be sometimes is in a place where you're in the passenger seat rather than the driver's seat, where you're letting the drawing unfold in its own way. You're just there to move the pencil. And what ends up happening down the line as you are compelled to direct it in certain directions, well, that's anybody's guess, especially your own. This is called the drawing journey. This is why we enjoy drawing. And somehow, when we first start getting into studying this stuff, we forget that. We forget that it was never about being perfect, but it was about being creative. And you could argue that creativity and perfection are almost the antithesis of one another. Creativity, it breaks the rules of perfection. Truly creative work goes beyond any expectations of idealism. Now, of course, that doesn't mean to say that you can't click into the aspects of a character and integrate them into your own that makes them appear desirable, that makes them the ideal in the eye of the beholder. And yet still at the same time, you can introduce a flavor of creativity that is uniquely your own, that sets your character apart, yet still upholds the familiarity, still upholds the good cliches that make a character work, that make them relatable, that make them appealing. And so you'll notice here that the poses that I'm laying down onto the page for this female figure, this female character that I'll be drawing out here, they're not unlike the poses that you might have seen for a sexy looking character. You can see that these poses are alluring, that they have that sex appeal incorporated within them. That's the feeling that I'm intentionally trying to go for here. And so I'll be tapping into, whether it's on a subconscious level or on a conscious level, or based on reference material that I might be observing at the time, and I wasn't for this, I was just pulling it out of my head. But you'll be tapping into some library, whether mental or otherwise, an assortment of poses that you associate with being sexy, with being attractive, in the context of a female character. And that's exactly what I'm doing here. But then sometimes I'll just draw down a very quick gestural line that'll establish the direction that the leg or the arm or the entire torso might flow in, and I'll just try it out to see what happens, to see how it feels. And sometimes it won't work out. Most of the time it won't work out. But then sometimes lightning will strike, and you'll find that you've just come up with an alternate pose that works extremely well that you might not have come up with if you hadn't been daring enough to just lay that gestural line down, to direct the leg in a different way other than what you had initially maybe intended. And so what I'm really trying to get at here is, as I said, the importance of exploration and experimentation during this phase. It's so important that you take advantage of that. If you're going to make mistakes, if you're going to go down the wrong road, let it be here, before you've spent hours upon hours inking out the line art, or laying in the details, or the rendering for that matter. Because if you have a fundamental flaw in your figure at this point in time, it is going to be absolutely tragic. The reason as to why it's going to be so detrimental to the illustration is because a foundational flaw often relates to and is connected with the proportions of your character or the pose of your character. You could argue that anatomy and the placement of the muscle groups aren't even as important as the proportions in the pose of your character, because they too are directed by those elements. And so focus on that at the beginning. Optimize the process. Optimize the thoughts that you're having, the things that you're considering at this stage, so that you can make the best decisions according to them possible. Because while your mind is filled with other stuff, other concerns, such as whether or not the artwork is going to turn out, or how other people are going to judge it, putting yourself down because of a lack of confidence, beating yourself up because maybe your artwork doesn't meet your perceived standards when sitting next to somebody else's that you admire more. No, don't think about any of that stuff. Just think about the pose. Be in the moment. Don't even think about the pose. Feel the pose. Feel it out. Does it feel like it works? What's it evoking for you? And if you can find yourself in that state during the initial stages of the drawing process, you'll surprise yourself with what you're able to come up with what you pull out of your mind and draw down onto paper. Because then it becomes an organic experience. One where it doesn't matter what kind of plan you might have had going into it, you're able to let go and you're able to play a little bit. You're able to just have some fun. And isn't that why we enjoy drawing? Isn't that how we felt as a kid when we first picked up the pencil? It can be so difficult to get back to that place after you've studied this stuff for years and years, trying to figure it out, being obsessed with getting your figure drawings correct, being obsessed with making sure the muscles are positioned, scaled, and placed in the exact area that they need to be throughout the entire body, or getting the proportions on point. And it occupies our mind to the extent where no other component, no other consideration of illustration really has a chance to take hold. And it stresses us out. It burdens us with this necessity to be perfect. It conditions us to make it look a specific way. And unfortunately, that is the antithesis of what makes a drawing memorable, what makes it creative, what makes it unique. Somehow we forget that proportions and our understanding of anatomy, figure drawing as a whole, was only there to serve as a tool. That really, creativity should have always have come first, and only when we run into trouble, only when we discover that our characters look kind of out of whack, do we need to pull those tools out of our bag and use them to correct the areas in which the figure has gone wrong. And it's only years later that I've realized that myself. Because for many years, I was teaching people how to draw their characters in proportion. I was trying to teach myself how to do that. And so anything I drew really was associated with some kind of anatomy study, some kind of diagram. But rarely did I actually sit down to draw a comic book cover or a comic book page or just an illustration for the heck of it. I used to when I was younger, but somewhere along the line, for decades, well, not decades, but at least a decade maybe, I was stuck doing studies. And this wasn't just me. This isn't an experience that I only go through. This is something that the people I found I was mentoring were also stuck on. This purgatory of figure drawing and anatomy and proportions and just filling up their sketchbooks with nothing but. When at some point you've got to be able to apply this stuff. You've got to be able to integrate it into an illustration. You've got to be able to use it for the very thing that you set out to learn this stuff to do. Because that's a different ballgame. Just because you're great at drawing your characters in proportion or with perfect anatomy doesn't mean that you're going to be able to create great art, that you're going to be able to create something compelling, something that draws people in. We forget that our own creativity is a very important ingredient within our artwork. And arguably, the more stuck we become in the fundamentals, in the learning process, the less creative we become. But you know what? There's light at the end of the tunnel. Because a point does come, a day arrives where you find your figures are becoming looser. Where you're trying things out that you never tried before, and this seems to happen naturally. It's been happening for me more and more, where you're able to detour away from the structured approach that you'd been learning for so long. And now you're going through a phase of construction that is much more ambiguous, much looser, and maybe this still looks structured to you, what I'm drawing down onto the page. And it is, because I am still thinking about the fundamentals that I've learned in the past, and I'm using them here, but I'm just using them in a much looser way. And I'm trying to put my creativity first, using the construction method that I have come up with that has worked for me time and time again as the building blocks for my idea. And it's so amazing how these building blocks can ultimately serve the idea instead of the idea being confined to the building blocks, which oftentimes happens to artists that just simply don't have a whole lot of experience, that are getting into this for the first time. It's amazing that at some point you arrive in a place of development where all of a sudden all those principles that you learned, you're making them work for you in the context of the idea. But it's this strange synchrony that comes about too, because the two work together. It's not just one or the other anymore. There's no separation. They work hand in hand to help you to convey your idea on the page, and then slowly but surely you build it up. Now, as I was saying, these figures, though they may look structured to you, for me are quite rough. They still have a lot of room for refinement, for further development, in other words. And indeed, you'll see me further refine and develop these figures. There may be entire limbs here that I erase. I'll adjust the anatomy so that it fits what I want, getting closer and closer to ultimately what the final outcome will be for the figure. But it is a journey that you go on. It's not something that you figure out right from the get-go. You have to just go with it and trust, have faith that it's going to work out. Why is this important? Because we as artists, we have this tendency to judge ourselves so brutally in the beginning, just because it doesn't look perfect, just because it's not a masterpiece yet. What we don't understand is that it has every potential in the world to become a masterpiece, but we've got to put the work in to make it happen. And so these days, when I view drawing and think about the process that I go through in order to execute an illustration, I see it more as a sculpting process, as though I literally have a bowl of clay, or in this case, I have got a very roughly drawn clay shape of the figure on the page, and I'm going to carve away bits and pieces of it. I'm going to shape it into what I want it to be. And I find that coming at it from that angle, thinking of the character illustration process within that frame, seems to be a more appropriate fit for the approach. It seems to work better for me to think of it in that way, because it allows me to detach from that immediate perfectionism somewhat. It gives me the room to breathe, the room to develop the drawing, and the optimism to know that, hey, no matter how it looks at the start, no matter what doubts I have about it, many of them will be attended to and probably eradicated throughout the course of this illustration's creation. So you can see now that I've picked one of the female figure drawings to go with here. And that's what's so cool about having an assortment of different options that you can pick from at the start. You can get all the bad ideas out, but also you can discern what's good from the bad. You're able to get your great ideas down onto the page too. And sometimes it is mixed in there with the bad stuff. Oftentimes I find that there's just going to be that period of time where you're not going to be great. Nothing you draw down on the page is really going to be your best stuff. And but here's the thing, you've got to get it out. You've got to unclog the system in order to get to the good stuff. And so that's exactly what I did with the poses that you see me sketching up before. And ultimately, I decided to go with this pose. I ran it past a few different people asking for their opinion because I don't know what looks good sometimes. I don't know if my take is necessarily the best take. I'm biased when it comes to my own art. What I think would work may not in reality actually look good to other people. So maybe I am a little bit preoccupied with the thoughts and judgments of those that will ultimately see the finished presentation, but still I value the opinion of others. I like to get their input on this stuff. So I choose the pose that I like best, that I think will work most ideally for the character, and then I go through a developmental phase where I further refine the pose and get it closer to what it is I'm looking for. And here I'm going through the entire thing with a fine-tooth comb. I'm looking for all the areas that can be tweaked and perfected, reshaped in even subtle ways in order to make it look better, to iron out the wrinkles. And I think that a lot of the time, shape is one of the primary concerns that I have. You can see this is especially apparent around the thighs of the character, around the shoulders, around every single part of the figure, the torso, anything really but the head at this point in time. Because, well, the head requires special attention unto itself. At some point, I'm going to zoom in here and I'm going to lay in the facial features, shape the face, and draw out the hairstyle, get it looking the way that I think it needs to look. But before I get to the head, I want to focus on the broader areas of the figure and make sure that's correct, make sure that's good to go first. And so I continuously work through the figure, adjusting almost every portion of it so that it looks right. And I will go over each section multiple times, using a combination of the eraser and the pencil tool. And I don't mind this portion of the process either. I think that it is very engaging, to be honest with you. It's a phase within the illustration process that feels like a fun challenge, because the hard part is really done. The idea generation is, for the most part, completed. Maybe there'll still be things that I add in there later on, but a lot of the thinking is done, especially on a fundamental level. And so now I can just take what's there and work with it. I can make decisions that are based upon what I've already drawn. I'm not just pulling it out of thin air anymore. And the brilliant thing about that is mistakes that I would have made have already been made, and I can see them. They're clear to me. Based upon those mistakes, I can direct my decisions and make the necessary fixes that'll allow me to get closer to the ideal representation of the character. Perfecting the anatomy, the shape of that anatomy, and really the muscle groups underneath the skin, they're what creates the shape of the body, so I am always trying to consider that too. You don't have to outline every single muscle group throughout the entire body in order to do this either. As long as you've got a general understanding of how these muscles come together to form the overall masses throughout the body, then you'll be okay to shape it appropriately. This comes through repetition, through practice, of course. You can see that I've laid in a little bit of a background there just to give the scene a sense of place so that the character isn't floating in a white void. As I said before, the character that I'll be drawing up here is from an anime series called Dragon Ball Z. Her name is Bulma, and you could say that this is more of an alluring representation of her. So I am going for something that is an intentionally sexy. Something that is supposed to be attractive in a feminine way. You can see that through the pose itself. I haven't even added in any of the clothing design just yet. I haven't given her a seductive facial expression or anything like that. It's purely through the body language, and already you're starting to feel it. And so body language is extremely potent when it comes to how the audience feels about your characters. That's why I place so much emphasis on pose, construction, and proportions at the start. Don't get caught up in your head about it, but certainly have that where your focus is, because otherwise you miss out on the opportunities there to make your character more convincing, believable, to look more alive, to have your audience relate to them and feel about them the way that you want them to feel. You are in charge of directing that, at least at the start. Once things get underway, though, you want to tune out a little bit, of course, but you don't want to tune out completely. You've got to be present. You've got to be able to make decisions, of course. Things still matter. The decisions you make are still important. You just don't want to be too attached to the outcome. Think of it like a scale. It's not one or the other. It's somewhat of a gray area, somewhere in between. You don't want to be so concerned with the outcome that you're placing these insane expectations on yourself, which is completely destroying any joy you had working on the piece. But you also don't want to be so detached that you become complacent, that you make mistakes that you don't notice or that you can't be bothered attending to. This is not a good way to illustrate either. You want to meet somewhere in the middle, maybe leaning more toward detachment from outcome and being more present, but still paying attention to when you mess up, being conscious of the potential mistakes that you might make enough to correct them if they do end up happening. One of the reasons that a great artist can be separated from an artist that has less experience, that hasn't been in the game as long, is the only thing that creates a distinction between them is that the artist with more experience is able to pick up on mistakes faster and fix them quicker. Whereas when you're only just learning this stuff for the first time, it's impossible to see where you're going wrong. your reticular activation system, the things that you need to be aware to in order to be a great artist, simply hasn't been developed enough yet through experience. And so it does come with practice, it comes with experimentation, and it comes with knowledge over the course of time. You need to be consistent with your drawing. You need to be filling sketchbooks up with pose after pose, with anatomy study after anatomy study, but still mixing it in with actual illustrations. You want to see whether or not that knowledge you've been collecting, those areas you've been trying to get competent in, are actually working. That you're able to serve the purpose you want to serve with them. Don't forget the dream. Don't forget what it was you wish you could have drawn as a kid. I know when I was younger, I thought about the artists that I admired most. I saw the work that they were capable of creating, and I'd imagine the things that I would draw if I had their very same ability. Don't forget what those things are. We all have those desires to draw something, whether it's a big grisly monster, or a muscle-bound superhero, or a sexy lady, an alluring woman with a feminine energy that draws you in. It's exactly what I'm trying to evoke here through this lovely lady's pose. Now, you can see that I'm really starting to sharpen my lines up. I've turned that initial pose blue on the layer below using a neat little layer color button that we've got available to us in Clip Studio Paint. And then I've created another layer above that, taken down the size of my pencil brush, and now I'm starting to really refine the shape of the body and even integrate different details that I'd like to see present in the final line art illustration. I'm tightening things up here. I like what's happening on that rough preliminary level, and now I'm starting to set some of that in stone. And I want it to be fairly tight because from this point onward, I'll jump straight over into the inks. My lines are tight, but they're not 100% polished at the penciling stage. Now, I saved that for the inks, but I do want enough information here that nothing is really left to guess once I get to the inks. Nothing's left up to chance. Now, there will be, from time to time, situations where I realize I've completely flubbed up on a aspect of the penciled illustration that needs to be drastically adjusted. And that may happen during the inks, which is always a little bit concerning, but it does happen from time to time. However, it's no big deal. Remember that we're working digitally here. And even if you were working traditionally on this stuff, where there is a will, there is a way, and at any stage throughout the process, you can pull out the whiteout, you can pull out the eraser, you can make the fixtures you need to make, and ensure that your artwork winds out to be the epitome of what it possibly can be. See, you need to be able to have the will, the commitment, and the discipline to sit down and fix your mistakes no matter how long it takes. Because laziness is another big reason why some artists' work just isn't up to par. And unfortunately, that is the truth. You ask anybody who doesn't draw, who observes an immaculate piece of art, and what do they always say? I say, man, that's amazing, but I would never have the patience to draw that out. And the funny thing is that sometimes artists don't even have the patience to be able to pull something like that off. But when you do have the patience, when you've got that level of unbreakable dedication, you will sit there for as long as it takes. You'll put the work in, and you will submit to the illustration. You'll be enslaved by it, and you'll work on it until it's done. You'll do what it takes to get it to be the best it possibly can be as well. And in the end, what you have to ask yourself is, well, how important is my art to me? Is it that important that I have that much patience in order to see it through to the best of my ability, to the best of what I am capable of? And if you truly value what it is you're capable of, what it is you're able to produce, your art, if you have the utmost respect for it, then you'll do exactly that. Even if it takes you weeks to complete a single illustration, you'll sit there and you'll make it happen, day after day, hour after hour, maybe night after night, depending on how into it you are. It's important to respect your art, because if you don't respect it on that level, you'll know deep down that you're not really in it for the long haul, that you're not truly somebody who cares about your art. You have to love it. You have to cherish it. You have to value what it is you're able to do. If you get to a point after years and years of study and development only to produce things that works of art that you know are below what you're capable of, it's going to mess with you. You need to be able to rig your success, to remain inspired, to wake up with the energy, the will, and the joy within you to draw something great. And if you're always cutting corners, you're being lazy, you don't really feel like doing it, then there's something wrong. That means that either that ship has sailed for you and you need to focus your energy and your attention on something else, or you've associated some level of negativity to your art. Now, whether it is that you're not stepping up and you know that you're being a lazy artist, if that's the negative emotion you've associated to your art, well, that's just something that has to change up. Start respecting yourself in your art again. See it as something that people appreciate, something that others value, and so you should as well. And you know what I'm talking about here? It sounds crazy. Like, man, if you could draw anything you want to the most ideal ability, to the level that you could possibly imagine drawing it to, wouldn't that be amazing? And yet you would find yourself in reality, sometimes with just not enough challenge to sink your teeth into. Sometimes you just wouldn't have that tension there to keep you engaged. When things are too easy, they become boring. And of course, that's something that can be very difficult to deal with as an artist, because if you're working on something for a long time and you're bored for the duration of it, how motivated are you going to be to jump into another piece of art afterwards? Of course you're going to want to get it over and done with. But again, you've got to change things up. You've got to change your perspective on that stuff. Otherwise, you simply won't enjoy drawing. Because if you're always performing below what it is you're capable of, it's going to just make you feel like a less of an artist. And it's going to make you a worse artist too, because if you ignore the mistakes that you make for long enough, the imperfections within your art, they'll stay there. They'll become reinforced, and they'll get worse. More and more flaws will start to seep in to your art. And you can see this happen with professionals who have been drawing for a very long time, who used to have an incredible standard for what they were able to produce, and yet, for some reason or another, they've dropped the ball. They become an artistic slacker, and their work just doesn't measure up whatsoever to what they were once able to do. And it can be intimidating to try and outperform yourself each and every time, to look at the amazing stuff that you were doing yesterday or even years ago and try to somehow measure up to it. Because when you're young and when you've got an axe to grind, when you've got something to prove to the world, it's something that can provide an incredible amount of fuel to your motivation. But once you solve all of the riddles, once you solve all of the challenges, once you pass all the obstacles, all of a sudden, what is there to drive you? I mean, you're at the top of your game now. You're among the best of the best when it comes to creating comic book art or any sort of illustration. You're a pro. What is there that's left to drive you if not the motivation to get better? Because there's no need to really get better if you're at the top of the mountain, is there? Well, you've got to find whatever your new purpose is going to be in order to continue moving forward and producing work to the degree of quality you've always produced it to. And don't worry, everybody goes through this at some stage. Arguably, you should value being a beginner for that reason, because you will never be more motivated than when you're not good enough yet. Isn't that crazy? Of course, some beginners get so motivated because they see the amazing art around them and they go, man, I'll never get to that point. And that doubt can be a massive motivation killer, of course. But to the right person, it can provide an incredible amount of drive. It can make them even more determined. It really depends on what kind of artists they are. Do they give up in the face of an insurmountable challenge? Or does it get them excited? Do they just become more motivated because of it? More motivated to succeed? Will they be knocked down? Will they be pushed over? Or will they continue marching forward regardless because of how important this is to them? You've got to get your belief system in check. For me, one of the primary things I always, without a doubt, bought into was the development of skill, and how no matter what it was you were practicing, with enough repetition, you could get good at it. You could become competent, you could master it, and all it took was repetition. Learning the right things, of course, repeating the processes that ultimately would have a good outcome, because there are, of course, bad ways of drawing that once ingrained into your workflow can be difficult to undo. You certainly want to try to avoid at all costs following a process that is flawed. But still, ultimately, if you're able to get the right process down, and you're able to practice it enough times to get good, it's inevitable that you'll arrive at the place that you have always dreamt of being as a comic book artist. You have to have a strong vision inside your mind of where you want to end up. One that keeps you going for many, many years. One that allows you to wake up obsessed with getting better at your craft each and every day. One that pulls you forward even when you don't feel like drawing. It won't let go. It makes you put pencil to paper because that vision is so great inside your mind that life just wouldn't be worth living if you're never able to realize it. If your craft is that important to you, of getting good, as at that level of necessity for you as an artist, then you're going to get to where it is you want to be. I can promise you that. But it's got to be, like I said, it's got to be strong. So you can see here that I've been working on the face. I've got the facial features drawn in, the eyes, the nose, the mouth. I'm laying in the neck. A lot of the time what I find is that, and this is one of the reasons I try to get the body down first, get that refined, get it to be the way that I want it to be, is because after I tend to the head and I draw out the face, I've often got to resize it. I've got to scale it up because for one reason or another, I have a tendency to draw heads too small. And it's a mismatch of proportions between the facial features and the rest of the body, because we measure out the face with particular units as well. For example, the head is about 5 eye widths wide. And then you've got the positioning of the eyes themselves, which sit at about the midway point of the overall height of the head, roughly speaking, maybe a little bit above that, depending on the formula that you're following for head proportions. And then, of course, you find where the nose sits. I typically divide the distance between the eyes and the chin in half in order to get that. And then below the nose, we place in the mouth. We simply divide up the area between the nose and the chin into thirds, and I drop the mouth opening on that first third, just below the nose, as I said. Then we've got the ears. The ears are going to sit on the nose line and come up to align with the brows, giving us the height of the overall ear. And that just about does it for head proportions. It's about getting those facial features positioned correctly. And then the other important aspect of drawing the head is, of course, making sure that it's got the correct shape. And a lot of that shape is going to reside around the jawline and chin. We want to really make sure that that's as perfected as we can get it, especially on a lady character, because what you have to understand is there's not a lot of detail to play with on a female character. When it comes to men, you can drop in the cheekbones, you can add in wrinkles around the brows, and you can chisel out the chin, give them a nice shapely jawline, and that's great. There's a lot of visual representation you can incorporate in there, but when it comes to a female character, you've got a limited amount of lines to use, because any line you lay down onto the face beyond the facial features is either going to age them or cause them to look gaunt, more mature, typically, more manly. So you really want to be very, very reserved about the amount of detail that you add into a female face and to a female body for that matter. You want to keep them looking soft, and the best way to maintain that soft appearance throughout the female figure is to leave as much detail as you possibly can out of it. Because think about this. If you see a really ripped bodybuilder on the stage, for example, what you'll notice is that there's very little softness to them. They're very chiseled, very little fat on their body, which is why you can see all their anatomy, all their muscles popping out of the surface of their skin. With someone who's more soft, you don't get that clarity. You don't get that level of definition in the anatomy. And so if we take that and we apply it to a female character that we want to have appear soft, then what does that tell us? It means that we need to stop defining the anatomy of every single muscle group throughout the entire body in order to get that appearance and maintain it within the character. So that's a little trade secret there that is really going to help you out. And the best part about it is it's going to require less time. However, it will mean more attention paid to the outline of each of the primary areas throughout the female body. To the outline of the face, you want to make sure that you're getting the shape right within the areas that you would otherwise or outside the areas within of which you would otherwise be defining the anatomy. Because what's interesting is that the shape of the character will, and every part of it, will suggest the anatomy inside without you necessarily having to show it. That's why you want to capture a good shape, because the human eye tends to imagine or fill in the details. We assume it's there without really being consciously aware of it. And so sure, at the start, when you're first sketching out the drawing, lay in all the muscle groups, because they are going to help you to capture the correct shape for your character. But certainly don't ink in the division of the muscle groups. Don't declare every single one of them visually. You don't need to do that. You can leave most of them out. Only use those muscle groups to help you shape the outline of each section of the body. And what you'll find is you'll get a very soft, very appealing looking representation of your female character. So I should probably talk about, as we're developing the drawing here, refining the anatomy more and more, I want to talk about whether or not I'm using reference here, the purpose that reference serves, and to what degree you really need to use it. Am I just imagining this anatomy? Is this just a representation of the female figure that's been stored away inside my brain waiting to come out? Well, certainly not. It's a little bit of both. So what I'll tend to do is, rather than using a reference right off the bat to figure out what kind of pose I'm going to have for the character, and I may still have some references there, but I like to try and keep the foundations a little bit more creative. I like to come up with something new just through the process of jotting down a variety of different poses, and through the warm-up period, really. Because during that warm-up phase, you really can have a lot of fun with it, and you never know what you're going to come up with. If you've got a reference there that you're trying to imitate or hold yourself to, well, what's that going to cause? It's going to cause a certain level of rigidness within the foundational construction of your drawing, something that you will want to avoid at all costs, because as you begin layering in on top of that the refinement passes of the illustration, it's going to start to stiffen up by default. And so if your drawing is already quite rigid, then that's only going to make it look much more, you could say, petrified. You know, when they set things, when someone turns, when a sorceress turns someone to statue, that's sort of what ends up happening to your drawing. It just hardens up. There's not as much fluidity to it, not as much movement. And so you want to be integrating that as much as possible during the foundational stage, so that hopefully you can maintain it going through into the final drawing. But that's why I like to stay away from references at the start, at least. And if I do use them, it's really only for inspiration. It's if I'm having a difficult time coming up with any ideas, despite the varied poses that I might be jotting down onto the page, then maybe I'll resort to using some of my favorite references that I've been collecting. And I do have a resource folder on my hard drive full of sexy hot babes that I do refer to when it comes to these types of female character drawings. But as I said, they really don't serve a important purpose at the start. Now later on, when it comes to getting the anatomy and the proportions right and incorporating the anatomical details that I might want to see within the finished artwork, then I'll start to look at a bit more reference, just to remind myself what needs to go where and ensure that the details themselves are of an accurate nature, because obviously my brain isn't big enough to store every single subtle little detail concerning the female figure within it. There's so many muscles throughout the human body that no human brain could store them. So many subtleties, so many nuances to the shape of the figure that can't be stored at a high degree of resolution. Unfortunately, that's just really the way it is. Our brains can only hold so much information. Hey, I hope that you enjoyed part 1 of my Bulma fan art demonstration and that you got a ton of value out of it. I've got a link to part 2 in the description below. If you'd like more comic art tips, tricks, and tutorials, be sure to visit www.howtodrawcomics.net. Over on the site, you'll find a ton of written tutorials, videos. Heck, we've even got a podcast. When you're ready to take your comic art skill set to the next level, then I'd highly recommend taking a browse through our premium selection of comic art courses by talented instructors such as David Finch, Trank Kanuga, myself, Ed Foychuk, Robert Marzullo, and many more. Until next time, keep on drawing, and I'll catch you soon. Bye-bye for now.